Hello, my name is Tony Sorrentino. I'm an associate vice president at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I work at the intersection of city planning, public affairs, community, and economic development. Here at Penn, we've been at work on an anchor institution strategy for roughly 20 years. Recently, we've decided we have to add an element to that anchor institution strategy, and that is explore the university's role in creating affordable housing in West Philadelphia. This is a new subject for us, and I think as a lot of anchor institutions around the country are grappling with this issue, along with all the other anchor institution elements. It's important to kind of set up a baseline that we can all learn from each other as part of this anchor community that we're in. And so the concept here for today's presentation is the first of several presentations that we'll be working on together in 2024. The concept here is a baseline of information about how Penn has approached this subject strategically. And we would hope that it's replicable and perhaps all of you can learn from it as you dive into your own strategies around this. Subsequent conversations on this are going to be very specific, much more tailored to individual components and elements. So let's get started on the presentation itself. So we're here in Philadelphia, which is one of the top 10 largest cities in the United States. We've got about 1.6 million people, make up 140 square miles or so. But we also have the dubious distinction of being the most impoverished big city in the United States of America. And that comes with a lot of challenges for us. And mostly it's associated with people living below the poverty line in substandard housing. The University of Pennsylvania is in a neighborhood of West Philadelphia and actually a subsection of West Philadelphia that goes by the name of University City. University City is roughly 2.5 square miles, but it's become kind of the anchor institution neighborhood and become kind of ground zero for the knowledge economy of Philadelphia. We have 5 institutions of higher learning. We have 85,000 jobs that are in the anchor institution space, or the eds and med space, as people refer to it. And the neighborhood itself, the residential neighborhood around the university, excluding the universities, is about 40,000 households. Penn itself makes up a big portion of this neighborhood. It's a 300-acre urban campus, at least 14 million square feet of buildings. We have 20,000 students, 10,000 undergraduate, 10,000 graduate, and 18,000 faculty and staff. It's a significant number. When you add in the hospital, that's part of our campus as well, you'll see that we're about 40,000 employees. Now, what's interesting about Philadelphia is the constant shifts over the last 2 decades based on race and class and socioeconomic status. So I show you this slide because as each of you go into your anchor institution strategy, it's quite important to be able to know kind of where you've been, where you are today, and where the trends are projecting that you may go. You can see here that the non-Hispanic white population in Philadelphia has been getting smaller. The Black or African-American, Hispanic, and Asian population has been getting larger. These are essential elements to know when also looking into the overall socioeconomics of your city and where your campus is located. We've also looked at lots of data around employment. The unemployment rate in Philadelphia, you can see here on the top line in the light green, has been higher than the United States and higher than our metropolitan region writ large. Because housing and income are connected, it's really important to understand the trends on unemployment over time. Now, you can see here when the pandemic hit, there was a huge spike in unemployment, and that's been kind of normalized a little bit. But it's important to look over the last 10 years where unemployment has kind of been going down nationally and then regionally and locally. So it's not like we're that great of an outlier on the trend front, but our numbers are really high. So you should all be encouraged to look into the own data around unemployment in the cities that host your university, college, or anchor institution. It's also important to look at the job sectors and the job categories. For this particular slide, I draw your attention in the middle portion where it says education and health services. So the green bar is 2020, the orange bar is 2021. It's just a snapshot in time, but it shows you the percentage of jobs and a little trend in growth over a year of where Philadelphia's strengths lie. It's clearly an eds and meds kind of city. Used to be a very strong industrial and manufacturing economy, but over the last 20 or 30 years, that has shrunk considerably. And it's been replaced by professional services, hospitality, tourism, but the preponderance here is eds and meds or anchor institutions. Going down a little bit more narrow to this University City neighborhood that I was mentioning before, we wanted to look into our own backyard and do some data diving that we encourage all of our anchor institutions to do as well. You should know what the population is in the neighborhood that you call home. All of this is available on the US Census, American Surveys Communities. You can do all of this stuff for free and readily available on the internet. You can also use the same documents to understand the percentage or numbers of people holding bachelor's degrees or higher. And you could look into the median household income and the number of jobs. So we have 2 points in time here. 2007 is really at the beginning of where our anchor institution strategy was really beginning to pick up some steam. It was about 6, 7 years old. And so we wanted to use that as a point in time. And then we looked at the last decennial census in 2020. And you could see that population is growing significantly, as is the number of people moving in or growing with us are well educated, which leads to a higher household income going up on the median front, as well as the job. So as this becomes an eds and meds neighborhood, it seems that those that move in and reside here are part of that economy as well. And these are professional service jobs for the university, but it's a range of jobs. That's the wonderful thing about anchors, is you have this ability to hire up and down the jobs ladder. Staying in the neighborhood, we wanted to look at trends in home sales. We're very sensitive to the idea of gentrification and whether or not homes are becoming out of reach for people. Also, just in terms of renting, the median one-bedroom apartment, you could see it's doubled in that time. These are indicators that one has to pay attention to if they're thinking about their anchor institution strategy. And so the other question in neighborhoods around colleges is, what is the percentage of owner-occupied, single family, or renter? These are predominantly renter kind of neighborhoods. So whenever you can track trends in owner-occupied housing, it gives you an indication of who wants to live near a campus. And if it's fewer students and more families or non-students, that's a decent indication that you're going to have perhaps a more vibrant, economically healthier community. Not that college students are bad neighbors, but you want a mix, so it's not just predominantly college students. And so you want to put this in the larger context. So in Philadelphia, we've been looking at this idea of gentrification for quite a long time. This is a map of Philadelphia that shows you the whole city in outline. And you can see in the downtown of Philadelphia, that is the section that's a rectangle that's between the north and the south and the west that you can see on this slide. That's our center city. The University City there that I mentioned is to the west. And then there are these what we call spillover neighborhoods, because Philadelphia is on a grid, a very seamless kind of urban grid. And it's got a row home typology of housing. So, and there's a decent public transit system that runs north, south, east, and west. So it's very easy to kind of spill over the boundaries of Center City. They're not really defined by anything superstructural. To the west, there is a river that you can see kind of flowing through there, but it's very easy to kind of leap over that. And that's where the university community is. What we've done, and you could do this with your scholars at your college or university, or maybe the Federal Reserve Bank, if there's one in and around your region, or other kinds of private nonprofit organizations that study data or housing data, you can start to look at the percentages of displacement or low-income families who are at risk of being displaced. What we did is we looked at household income, gross rent, and sale price. And we wanted to look at it over a period of time in the first half of the first decade of the 2000s to see what had happened in our neighborhood vis-a-vis gentrification after about 10 years of being an anchor institution. The results are less, to me, important or material as the process of looking at this data itself. So as you get into your anchor institution strategy, you can look at the citywide data, you can look at your neighborhood data, and it's really instructive to look at them next to each other to see if you're an outlier or if in fact you're part of a larger trend. Here in Philly, the gentrification that you start to see happening around University City is not isolated. It is not an outlier, but it's part of this spillover effect from the popularity of our downtown, more and more people wanting to live in that part of the city. What led us to the concept of exploring an anchor institution strategy isn't just the, are we gentrifying or not, but there was a real material event that happened recently on a property that Penn does not own, but is adjacent to the campus, just a few blocks away. The name of the property, you can see from this photograph, the University City Townhomes. It's at 40th and Market Street on the northernmost western boundary of Penn's campus. It's actually not even Penn's campus. The property opened in the early 1980s and for its time was really unique. Instead of a large tower for affordable housing, it had 3-story row homes with 3 bedrooms inside of them. So really different typology. So you had 67 3-story dwellings of 3 bedrooms. It was close to the jobs of the hospitals and the university. Public transit ran through there. Because of the university, there were pretty thriving commercial corridors that came in over time. Penn's anchor strategy was kind of happening around this affordable housing contract, or this project. And essentially what happened was those inside, living and dwelling inside of the homes, kind of were almost fixed in their income, in their socioeconomic status, whereas everything around it was kind of changing, improving. All of those statistics that I showed you earlier in terms of income, education, and the like. So the owner of the property, which isn't Penn, had maintained a contract with HUD for 4 decades. And this was subsidized housing from the federal government. And the company decided that it was time to move on from being in this business at this location. And they had accepted an offer to sell the property. And it was a pretty significant financial offer, and they wanted to move forward with it. But what it did was it caused a lot of tension in Philadelphia, particularly in West Philadelphia, because this was one of the last remaining Section 8 housing projects in a neighborhood. And what it did was it contributed to the socioeconomic diversity of the neighborhood. And if it were to go, it would be almost a kind of the last example of one of these kinds of projects. And so it caused a lot of drama, a lot of political drama. It led to legal action and a lot of activism. And the university was being brought into it to say, gee, University of Pennsylvania, you've really contributed to the improvement in this neighborhood. You have to own the responsibility that has led, unintentionally as it is, that has led to the potential displacement of those living in these 67 dwellings. You ought to be involved. We thought about it, we've reflected on it, and we started to ask ourselves, what is the role of a university in affordable housing? There wasn't much we could do with this particular property. It was privately owned, it was a private transaction, and it's regulated by the government. But we also started to understand that this may be the beginning of a trend where properties that were on contract with HUD might be coming up in their contracts, and that the owners themselves may be interested in converting them to market rate apartments. In other words, this could be the beginning of something that we ought to pay attention to. The activism got really intense. It started with those living in the townhomes, with simple kind of banners. The students at the university and other universities became very impassioned, very involved. They actually moved onto the property and were living in tents on the front lawn. That led to campus protests, citywide protests, and it just kind of get more and more intense as time went on. The legal action that was going on took a very long time, and that also contributed to the kind of drama and the length of that drama kind of playing out. Eventually, a legal settlement was arrived between the city and the owners of the property, and we kind of watched that from a bit of a distance. One of the dynamics that came into play here was so very interesting. After 30 or 40 years of having one city council person in our neighborhood, she was defeated in her race by a new council person from this area, a woman named Jamie Gauthier, who's a very strong advocate for housing and was able to successfully pass a piece of legislation in Philadelphia that mandated that any new housing development, multifamily housing development, would have to include 20% of its properties in what we would call inclusionary housing. So it was a zoning bill that said 20% of all new multifamily housing of a certain size and volume would have to carry affordable housing. And she did this based on her own really intelligent, thoughtful research. And she's an urban planner. She's trained at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's, I think, the only urban planner on city council. So she really approached this thoughtfully and did her own research and her own data. And it really contributed to that tension between whether or not an anchor institution is somehow responsible for the housing stock values and the land values around it. This is something that we in the anchor institution world know well. And so what we saw was this data here on this map shows you the kind of the areas around the University of Pennsylvania where the 19104 is, that's the zip code of Penn, and then the western neighborhoods are 19139 and 19143. It's a tight population. I mentioned before about 40,000 people live in this area, about two miles or so. And you could see the size of the circles represent the units of multifamily. And it was a pretty hot market that ultimately went kind of cold as a result of the zoning legislation, because it appeared that developers did not want to make 20% of their units affordable in new construction. And so you could see the kind of activity that was really robust with permits being pulled in this neighborhood for affordable housing. We haven't seen any new permits pulled in this neighborhood since the legislation went into effect. So essentially went from robust to kind of a weakened kind of market. And so we went from this thriving market where there was a huge amount of demand that was being met with a new supply. A lot of that came from the anchor institutions and all the development that we were doing: commercial development, retail development, office development, adding jobs, adding laboratories. We were able to attract really robust investment from the private sector. We will often do land leasing strategies where we attract private developers to come in and execute on multifamily apartment buildings or restaurants, retails, movie theaters, and the like. These were really interesting mixed-use projects. They were starting to overflow the traditional boundaries of around campus, making it feel like the campus was actually getting bigger off campus, even though it wasn't our property. And what this really generated was a bit of a crisis around affordability. So we did have to ask ourselves, what was our role, if anyway? So that's what this present situation is, but how did we get here? So Penn moves over to University City across that river that I mentioned in 1872, and that little red building there was basically the University of Pennsylvania campus. Above that, that purple axis, Woodland Avenue, was a strong access road that ran through West Philadelphia, and all those little blue boxes above that, north of that, were homes and churches and dwellings. It was an upper middle class neighborhood. Everything below it was essentially open space. And so this is a story about how a university grows in an area that above it was kind of urbanized and below it was kind of country. And you can see by 1915, the outlines of the red buildings just kept growing. By 1955, there was even more growth, but you could see the density is contained below Woodland Avenue and say between the river and that Woodland Avenue. And so not much to point to until you get into the era of urban renewal in the late 1950s. And you can see from this slide, the university grows over that Woodland Avenue access and really almost doubles its size, if not more. By 86, more, in 94, 2005. Some of this is through acquisitions. For example, at the upper left-hand corner was a local community hospital that we purchased and folded in to the Penn Health system. But this becomes the university's footprint, and it's really quite large. It's a significant amount of land. And so you can see over time where Philadelphians, specifically West Philadelphians, said, Well, this is a university that kind of ate the neighborhood that it was kind of in. And so, but while that was going on, there was another major change that I think is relevant for all of us that are in this industry to be aware of, which was the middle of 20th century American cities were all going through a kind of post-industrialism. Philadelphia was no different. It was also going through a booming suburbanization. Philadelphia was no different. And so cities were emptying out, suburbs were growing, filling in over time, the decades, hospitals and universities were playing a bigger role. The second half of the 20th century, Philadelphia went through kind of a magnificent and significant change in the structure of its economy. The manufacturing economy was pretty strong in 1950 with 365,500 jobs. It's really been reduced over time. I mean, it's down to 20,000, kind of 900. Health and education is where all of the jobs that were lost in manufacturing were gained. And so by 2015, Philadelphia is now home to 210,000 jobs, almost 211,000 jobs in what we would call the eds and meds sector. So this shows an incredible shift in who was working and where they were working and how they were making an income. Eds and meds jobs really replaced manufacturing jobs and provide a kind of stable middle-class life. So we were going through a lot of changes. And what we did was we came up with a strategy. And you can see on the slide, there's these kind of bubbles. In the middle, it says WPI. That stands for West Philadelphia Initiatives. And the West Philadelphia Initiatives was Penn's kind of original anchor institution strategy. It had these 5 interrelated program areas that we invested in that were to contribute to community and economic development. Now, the 5 were really crowdsourced after doing years of research with our neighbors and local residents and local businesses, as well as elected officials and civic leaders. And they really were 5 interrelated fronts. First and foremost was safety. It was a neighborhood that in the 70s and the 80s, like a lot of inner city neighborhoods in America, saw a rapid rise in crime against persons and a rapid rise in crime against property. And the area felt disinvested. As people moved to the suburbs, a lot of the properties went vacant. And if they weren't vacant, they were filled into kind of multifamily rooming houses for the college students that lived around there. So it really did make a material impact on the housing stock, which is relevant to the subject of affordability. And so safety was a really big deal. We wanted more of our faculty and staff to live in the neighborhood, walk to work, feel a part of the community. And so the university offered a cash incentive towards the purchase of buying a house in West Philadelphia. If people were going to buy a house, if they were feeling safe and they were going to buy a house, they might want to raise a family and educate their children. One of the things that we learned from our neighbors was that the quality of K-8 public education in the neighborhood was substandard. And was there room for a new public elementary school as basically a partnership between the University of Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers, and the School District of Philadelphia? And so that came into being. We started to look at the land assets that we owned, mainly underdeveloped parking lots or single-story retail fronts, as opportunities to either be a developer ourselves or the aforementioned land leasing with private real estate developers who would come in, lease land from us. They would take on the risk of design, construction, and operations, but they would have access to land that they otherwise wouldn't have. And together we would create a program that added amenities to the neighborhood. And lastly, this concept of economic inclusion. How do you get local residents, many of them of color, participating in the Penn economy? Are we hiring locally? Are we purchasing locally? Do we have an intentionality of buying and purchasing and hiring people of color in the neighborhood? Now, not every anchor institution can do a housing stipend. Not every institution has abundant land that they can lease or the ability to build an elementary school. But every institution can do economic inclusion. Every institution can take a hard look at the kind of products and services they buy locally. And if they're not doing enough, they can make a bigger commitment to it. Just to show you that some of the results have been good for us at Penn. Crime has been reduced in 20 years. We've also seen a little bit more than 1,000 people purchase homes in the neighborhood as a result with this beautiful Victorian housing stock. We've made a significant 20-year investment in the new public school that opened up in the neighborhood. You can see it's quite beautiful. We've made an addition of 400,000 square feet of new retail businesses. This is a grocery store with a parking garage up top. This is at the western boundary of Penn's campus, where the campus ends and the neighborhood starts. And the planning theory there on that corridor was make a corridor that is appealing to both the campus and the neighborhood. The idea is that the kind of retail you put on the street says who is invited. And we wanted everyone to kind of come together around grocery stores and cinemas and small independent shops. And then we're really quite proud that we've spent more than $1 billion locally with underrepresented minority businesses that are owned in West Philadelphia. A lot of it in the skilled trades, because these are incredibly lucrative jobs, especially on a campus like Penn that has a really robust capital project budget and is building every year and doing repairs every year and maintenance and whatnot. On the real estate front, just to quickly show you, moving from the left-hand side of your screen to the right, it really happened in 3 phases. In the very early days, it was difficult to attract anyone to want to invest. So the university did it itself, borrowing money from the debt market and being a developer and designing construction. In the phase 2, we had open pieces of land that were undeveloped or empty buildings. That was when we began to leverage the capital investments from the private sector would come in, and we would work together on what the program would be, and then they would take on the risk of design, construction, and operations. It doesn't look like it was too risky at all. It's done incredibly well, very robust, very occupied. But now we're in a phase 3, which is there's an inordinate amount of development happening around that's not related to our land, that's not us, the university, and so, but it looks like it is. And it appears to the naked eye that perhaps the university is actually growing, when in fact this is the response of the private market. And so going back to that idea of housing, this was the numbers that we used for people to come in and purchase homes. You can see it's a really interesting array of housing options. These are twin homes or row homes. They're really robust, beautiful neighborhoods, big sidewalks, beautiful trees. You also have apartment buildings in there as well. And so we talked about those people that have purchased homes in West Philadelphia. The original program was a person would get $15,000 towards the purchase of the home. That really did stimulate the market quite a bit. We reduced that number, so people use it now. And it's more of a closing cost reduction program as much as it is to stimulate people to buy, because it seems that the market is pretty stimulated. On the rental front, we put together a really interesting program that could be replicable and for anchor institutions. We identified properties, and you can see them on the bottom of your screen. These are properties that were built before World War II. It's an older neighborhood, and that they had fallen a little bit on hard times, and that they weren't necessarily always up to code. They represented kind of the bottom of the rental market, what people could afford at the lower level, maybe minimum skilled, minimum income people. We thought, well, let's see what we can do to improve the bottom of the market. So the university with partners purchased some of these buildings and then did all the necessary investment to bring them up to code, to make the life safety issues strong, to make sure that these were habitable, but to keep the rent below market. So it wasn't affordable housing where you have a Section 8 voucher or federally subsidized housing, and it wasn't rent control, which is an actual legal term, but it was almost like university subsidized rental housing. And the concept behind it was there was a working class in West Philadelphia that we were afraid was going to be gentrified out with some of the improvements that were being made. This was an idea that was 20 years ago. I don't think any of us could have foreseen what was going to happen in the neighborhood in 20 years' time. But to this day, we have a decent amount of units, about 20 different buildings, about 400 units that are all being rented, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms, to people who live kind of in the neighborhood. And so when you think about this housing market that I mentioned locally, we're close to now almost 50,000 people living, the population is, 73% of the households they look to be like multiple people living and renting a house together. That looks a lot like college students to us in the United States Census, which doesn't always track that. This is the other thing that's really important when you're getting into anchor institution work and it relates to housing, is that there's some limits on the data that you can get. The census doesn't tell you when a group of college students are living together on a rental property. But we can look at non-family or family households as a kind of a proxy. And what you've got here is 2/3 of the neighborhood seems to be non-related group housing, and a third of it looks like people in families. And so we were able to kind of look at that, and then you start to be able to look at those, and you can get this through the census, about their income level. And what's really important here is that college students sometimes show up on the United States Census as impoverished because they don't have incomes. So it can be a false positive that you have actually more poverty than you do. So that's an important thing for you able to look at. And I would encourage you all to find someone on your campuses who has real expertise in how the census is designed, how the research is done and executed. I'm certain people in your sociology departments and whatnot, business schools, kind of have that kind of stuff. But you can look at family versus non-family housing dwellings, and then it can be made available to you by the age of those that live in there, kind of who's there. So that's an important statistic to understand. I wanted to show this map of University City, the slice of University City. What we did when we bought these properties that I mentioned, these 20-odd properties, they were all kind of concentrated together. You could see them listed kind of 1 through 20 at the bottom of this kind of map. Penn is off to the right in that light yellow section. And it was a mix. Some of them were old homes that were converted into apartments. Some of them were built as apartments from the early days. But you could see that there was like this southern section, Spruce Street, Pine Street, where they were all kind of concentrated. I think it's not a surprise to find that some dilapidated buildings might be near each other, that certain sections of certain neighborhoods, when they get run down, have an influence on helping other programs and projects get run down. And so this was not just an intervention in the market for the renter, but an intervention in a pocket of a neighborhood that we were going to say, no, we don't want to see this fall below standards anymore. And how do we kind of lift it up? So I wanted to illustrate for you that you can also track where the buildings are geographically and see if any trends pop up. Are they clustering together or not? We went in and we were able to buy these projects for X amount of dollars. We made an X amount of dollar capital investment, about $4.5 million. And so the whole idea, as I mentioned before, was paint up, fix up, clean up, get this to a kind of new standard of minimum housing so that people could live safe and healthy. And so basically, we now have a census of who's living in these properties. And while the original intent was going to be just folks from the neighborhood, middle class, middle skilled, whatnot, you can see here today that it's not that. And this is the unintended consequence of providing apartment rentals that are below market in a college neighborhood. You can see now that 31% of the people living across those 400 units are undergraduate students at our 3 colleges. 18% are graduate students. And those are from Penn. USP stands for the University of the Sciences, which is a pharmacy school in the neighborhood as well. And it's university staff that are living there as well. 27% are non-affiliated with the local universities. So the dream that we had 20 years ago worked for quite a while, but the demand has increased in this neighborhood as it's gotten hotter, and it has suppressed the availability. And so now only a quarter of the people we're trying to reach are actually taking advantage of the university subsidized apartments. The other thing that you can do as an anchor institution, and we all can do this, is you should be able to track through a zip code analysis of your employees where they live. This is a map of Philadelphia. The numbers are the zip codes, and under the zip codes are the number of University of Pennsylvania employees who live in that zip code. So 19104 is where the University of Pennsylvania is included. More than 1,000 Penn employees live in that area. Just below that, in a decidedly working class neighborhood, 19146, it's also about 1,000 people. And so you can start to understand where your people live, and you can start to relate that to where housing values are going up. This is really important also when talking to elected officials. They can understand, wow, I have X number of Penn employees living in my neighborhood. That's quite good. These are good jobs. These are my constituents. but it also shows trends that people will want to live closer to work if they can. And so we've seen this now. Of the 18,000 university employees, more than half live in the suburbs. But of the 47% that live, you can see that the majority of them live, well, a high concentration, I should say, live around the university zip code of 19104, 19146, and the like. I also looked at it from the hospital side. Now we have suburban hospitals, so the 63% of hospital employees living outside of Philly makes sense because we've got 4 or 5 hospitals outside of the city. But 37% of hospital employees live in Philadelphia. And no surprise, again, this 19146 area shows up as an area where a lot of them live. You can walk to work. You can find a place that is somewhat affordable based on middle-skilled, middle-income salaries. What's interesting about hospitals and the job ladders, you've got surgeons and you've got orderlies. And what's interesting in Philadelphia is that both of those kinds of people want to live near work based on the hours that they keep, and they find themselves maybe competing for the same house, but a surgeon is going to have more disposable income. And so that's where the gentrification issue can kind of come in. But I encourage you as anchor institution leaders, planners, policy people, and thinkers to do all of this data research. And in previous discussions that we'll have as a community, we'll go deep into the mechanics of how to do all of this stuff. So what we've done is we've proposed a strategy to try to figure out what to do with affordable housing. We did a quantitative study of West Philadelphia and the housing market. We did lots of interviews with real estate developers to find out if they would want to work with us, if they would be interested in doing affordable housing. This is just all of the kind of research phase. We talked to our elected officials to assess their expectations of us, what we can do and what we can't do, and have those kinds of conversations. And then we've been having strategic planning conversations with the senior leadership team to say, should we or should we not be incorporating affordable housing into our anchor strategy? And if yes, what does it cost? Who does it? What are the roles and responsibilities? How do we get organized for success? Luckily for us at Penn, we have a think tank on campus that studies such issues, the Penn Institute for Urban Research. And we brought them on board to help us. They pull together scholars and students, and they try to solve urban issues from a multiple lens perspective. Could be real estate, planning, law, social policy, healthcare. So they came in, we engaged with them. They started to identify potential solutions for us and to review different options. So they looked at the map of West Philadelphia. You'll recognize these zip codes from the things that we looked at before. And they started to say, you know what? In this local area, there's a lot going on. Those purple bubbles that you see here, remember that's the preservation fund of the homes that Penn bought, the apartments, to keep kind of subsidized and below, but a lot of activity that's going on here. So it's really essential to know your geography, to know what you own where, and how it fits in to those larger maps and those larger trends. You have to define your area. Now, I'm not going to go deep on each one of these maps, only to show you that these are data sets that are available to you that you yourself can explore through public available data. Household income, we've already talked about that. You could look at it in all of the different zip codes, the ones that are around your campuses, and look at trends over time. We decided to go back 30, 40 years and see how is this trending over time. And you can see that there's a lot of decline around us, but also lots of spikes where gentrification is happening. You can also compare that to the city that you're in and to the United States nationally. So it's really important to look at household income and see what it's doing. The same is true for rent. What people make determines how much rent they can afford. And so you can see here a very steady increase in rent across the country, across Philadelphia, and the zip codes around the University of Pennsylvania. It's very important to know that rent is going up into where it is. Same with the home values, how they've been increasing, except for that one area that I was mentioning, 19146, where both the hospital employees live, the surgeons and the orderlies, has really gone up quite dramatically. People will try to find affordable neighborhoods around the university and the hospital, and they find themselves competing for the same kind of housing product. Want to look at the rates of home ownership. Are people renters? Are people buyers? This has a lot to do with interest rates. So it's beyond the scope of an anchor institution what the interest rates are. but it's the kind of data you can track, it's the kind of data you can learn from, that you can incorporate to your overall strategy. I think it's essential when you put these things together. And then there's this idea of who is not rent burdened. So, if you are rent burdened in this country, that means that you're spending more than 30% of your income on your housing. That means that you are rent burdened. You are severely rent burdened if it's more than 50%. And this is a publicly available information that you can do in your own areas. And we looked at it against those zip codes. Remember, know your geography. Once you lock in your geography, once you lock in the data that you want to collect, you can pull all of this together. What this showed us here is in those red areas, the number of people that are severely rent burdened. I say this with caution, and I mentioned it before. Always control for the college student who shows up on a census tract as impoverished, because they are not paying their own rent most likely. So we have to control for that. It's a little kind of a curveball that gets thrown at you, but it's important to know kind of nonetheless. And so the big takeaways here is that we know in Philadelphia, for example, there's a demand for affordable housing that far outpaces the supply. We have 43,000 families in Philadelphia on a wait list with the Philadelphia Housing Authority. We know that the private sector is the largest producer of affordable housing products. The federal government doesn't build it. The city doesn't build it as much. We know that rental cost housing are rising in and around the area of University City. You look at some of those other maps, you're seeing it was declining the further you get away from the university. So this is where some of the tension is coming to exist. We know that values are increasing. We know that the university's got to pursue some kind of strategy to help resolve some of these tensions. I think for anchor institutions, you don't always get to select what issues are going to be presented to you to help solve, but you have to kind of come together with your resources, identify your partners, identify roles and responsibilities, and figure out what can be done. Maybe it's not ours to solve by ourselves. For example, some of the research that we learned is between now and 2029, there's going to be 815 apartment units who have HUD contracts, whose HUD contracts are going to expire. If all of those landlords, all of those private market owners decide to no longer accept those Section 8 vouchers, but flip their property to private market rate rental, that's 815 people either on the street looking for a new apartment or becoming severely rent burdened, where they stay. And when you have a severely rent burdened population, the overall quality of life is going to go down in your area. And so we wanted to know where those HUD contracts on those low income housing tax credit properties were. And so this was done by some of our students at the Wharton School of Business. They actually were able to map where they were. And so the University of Pennsylvania is kind of in the middle down here below those University City townhomes that we mentioned. You can see where the affordable housing units are. It's to the north of Penn, it's to the west of Penn, it's to the south of Penn. But those are the areas where the gentrification could possibly be happening moving into the future. The size of the circle represents the number of those units. And you can see that there are large circles around the university that could be vulnerable to being flipped to market rate. And so what are the next steps? So as we think about our strategy, and we're not resolved yet, but we're getting there, what is our role? What options do we have? Do we bring in partners? Do we do it ourselves? Do we develop a strategy with government? And, are there properties that we own that could be adapted and rented out with partners as affordable housing? Do we even think about acquiring land for the banking and future development of affordable housing? So these are the questions that we've kind of asked ourselves and where we are in our planning process kind of going forward. And so as we think about what it means for an anchor institution strategy, we are basically evaluating all of these options. We're studying all of the data. We need to provide recommendations to our leadership, everything from pieces of land, specific buildings, the kind of financial resources that we're going to need. And these are things that we will kind of get into. But if we are going to accept our role as an anchor institution that does affordable housing, we need to kind of lay that out with clarity. So we're going to support West Philadelphia by increasing and preserving quality stock of affordable housing. We may be able to do that through a couple of different ways. It could be financing, could be philanthropic. One thing that we have done, which is really interesting to us, is we've identified a nonprofit partnership with an organization called Rebuilding Together. It's a national organization, and they've got a Philadelphia office. And what they do is they help senior citizen homeowners who may have to make some hard decisions between improving their homes or selling their homes, or improving their homes and affording their medications. What if they could raise money from philanthropic dollars to provide the kind of paint up, fix up, clean up, capital improvements for these senior citizens so they can age in place and stay in their homes? So we've decided to invest in Rebuilding Together Philadelphia for the preservation of 75 homes owned by senior citizens in West Philadelphia between now and 2027. Turns out that the average cost is only about $4,000 per structure. And we're going to be throwing our money in with others around Philadelphia to help these neighbors that we have. We're also being approached by real estate developers around the university who see the need for affordable housing, wondering if we would come in as an investor in their properties. Universities have endowments. Endowments often invest in real estate, something that we'll have to consider. But here's a project that's being built, without any of our help right now, to the north of our campus. And then, for any of those kinds of people that are being displaced, they're going to need help. And the United Way of Southeastern Pennsylvania or Greater Philadelphia is raising money for Philadelphians that are being displaced to give them the kind of financial counseling they need. They're beginning with that property we started with, the UC townhomes. And so we've decided to contribute to that as well. So there are early wins that we can get that are financial outlays for us with nonprofit partners already invested in this space, already doing this work to help people. What we have to consider kind of is whether or not we get into the development of this kind of housing or the supporting of this kind of new product that comes up. And that's where our strategy is now. So the final insights that I have for us today, and then hopefully we can work on this moving forward, is you have to do your research. It's not always easy, but you have to do your research. It can be incredibly effective in grounding you on where to go with your money or your land, or how to identify your partners. We don't think here at Penn that you could put all of your eggs in one basket, whether it's an anchor institution strategy or just a housing strategy. So it has to have the diversity of ideas. You're going to need partners. They should be carefully selected. People that have got track records in a space that you don't have. Not many universities have experience in developing affordable housing. Have to be realistic about the timing. This is going to take years, not months. Financing, you have to identify sources, whether it's from your operating budgets, or if you want to find partners, or even if you want to find philanthropists that want to support this kind of work. So these are the kind of elements that go into folding it all in to your strategy. Housing is part of jobs. Jobs is part of quality of life. Quality of life is part of education. If your anchor institution strategy includes all of those elements, it's very easy to see where affordable housing kind of neatly fits into that and is inextricably linked to that in some way. We talked about the timing being years, not months. It's also going to be slow. You have the variances of the housing market, the macro and the micro economy. It's best to set modest goals in this and start thinking of the returns in very long-term neighborhood stability. And it's really important to be clear what you can do and what you can't do. The last thing you want to do is raise expectations only for them to be dashed. People will often look at the anchor institution as a kind of a savior who can come in with a lot of resources. Our main job in this world is teaching, research, advancing knowledge, graduating citizens. That's the work of the university, but we do take on the role of being an anchor in our communities because that is also part of the mission of serving society. We're now exploring whether or not in service to society, we can contribute to affordable housing. So thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to talking to you more in greater detail in the months to come. Thanks.